Okay, hello everyone. My name is Gunn Jiravuttipong. I am a JSD candidate at the UC Berkeley School of Law, and today I'm talking about my research on the diffusion of digital competition regulation in Asia. So I want to start on or the motivation of the research, or where I am jumping in the literature. So I am jumping in the literature about global battles in regulating big tech. And as we have known, there's a big book called Digital Empire by Professor Anu Bradford from Columbia, that she wrote about these three big empires, the US, the EU, and China, that they are regulating the big tech, coming up with big rules, each have their own political and law coming out. And then we have another book, or we have learned more and more about China, big tech. One book that comes to mind is High Wire. This is by Professor Angela Zhang from she was at Hong Kong, but now she's moved to California. Um, so this is the three big book that has been talking about the big empires that is trying to regulate internet. Now, um, I'll pull up one sentence from Professor Anu Bradford's Digital Empire book, and when she does talk about what is happening around the world, but she doesn't go deep in detail that much. But there was one sentence that I really like, which is, in other countries, it is still an unfolding sphere of influence between empires, as whereas India, Brazil are still considering their approach to regulate big tech. So now there's probably a lot of activities going on around the world. And the New York Times in 2024 have just mentioned this, that they had a headline about forced to change how tech giants are bowing to global onslaught of rules. So this onslaught of rules is very important. It seems that there are a lot of rules coming out, and it's very affecting the big tech world. And then another literature that I am tackling is the traditional diffusion of competition law. Um, as we have known, that the competition law has been successfully diffused around the world, and it's one of the greatest story, or one of the stories that have has shown that law can spread around the world. So, to just a quick number on the success of the law, in 1970s, only around 12 countries have competition law, but then around 50 years, it is now up to 125 countries, or even more right now, and this constitute almost 95% of the global economy. But of course, the diffusion of competition law, with all its promise of um, of better competition, better economy or growth, it also has its limits. And there's a lot of literature on the limits of competition law, which is less resources, agencies are less independent. Competition law has a lot of exemptions to state-owned enterprise, or even cultures and other factors that doesn't make competition law deliver according to its promise. Another article that I am capturing is sponge-like characteristic. Um, so the law of competition law has always been told that it is susceptibility to national particularities that originated in its design and application, and it can be exposed to intellectual and regulatory capture. So this is from Professor Ezrashi in 2016, and he's from Oxford. And then I'm touching on a diffusion literature on the newer ones, which is a paper called Dynamic Diffusion. So what do we mean by dynamic? Before that, this is a article by Professor Anu Bradford, Adam Chilton, and Catalina Linos, which is my advisor at Berkeley Law. They studied how the a gap in the literature is that when we study about diffusion or transplant, we only focus on the initial adoption of the law, and then we don't track or forget about the subsequent development of the law. Now, these three authors have created a database, hand-coded, to see how competition law has evolved throughout the world. And they created a typology of how subsequent reforms have happened. And they said that there is three options of or pathways of the law diffusing. So there can be a continual convergence. So people adopt, for example, adopt uh something similar to EU, and then because EU is also developing, they also keep on developing like the EU. So this is converging. The second one is customizing. So sometimes adopting EU law or US antitrust law might not be good for the country. And maybe they have enough resource to think about this very hard and customize their law according to their local context to make it work. Um, and this is very clear on countries like, as you can see in the picture, Australia in the bottom right is a well-resourced, rich country, um, has a lot of experience in competition law. That's why they try to customize their law and they have the resource to do so. And then last is stagnant. So a lot of countries will also um, because they have less resources or they don't care about competition law after the adoption, the law can just stay there and never change. And we can see that a couple countries in Africa, a couple countries in Southeast Asia falls under this color of stagnant. But the overall theory here is that the paper tries to argue that the economic size and the geographic distance from the leading regulator predicts a pattern of countries to follow. So this is one of the literatures that I try to replicate or use this in my own research. And then the last literature, which is also by Catalina Linos, she talks about the democratic foundation of policy diffusion. So she talks about how if law is spreading in democracies, to pass laws or to pass reform, it must win the support of politicians, voters, interest group, and the wider democratic stakeholders. So sometimes law can diffuse in countries in a very public and politicized way. Um, and when it's politicized, sometimes the law is adopted around the world, even in countries that is a forfeit. And to explain it a bit more is that sometimes international models or international laws are, which is well known by the people, maybe through media, maybe through other means. Voters are familiar to these names or these countries. So politicians use these examples to win their support, to win voters. And they don't need to go into the details about the policies or the direction of change, but they just say that, oh, this country has successfully adopted, so we will also adopt and it will be successful. So this creates an incentive for politicians to convey or use these international models. Um, so that these literatures, the three literatures that I've talked to, boil down to my own research here. And this is uh, uh, a news heading that says, and I think it reflects my research question, is that are US platforms facing a growing wave of ex-ante competition regulation? And for me right now, I think I argue that yes, it is facing a growing wave of this new type of law. In a way, I can summarize my argument that the world is using US platforms, is copying EU law, but maybe it's trying to get China's result. In a sense that the state wants to have more say in regulating technology, wants to use technology for growth, and but also maybe means that they want to have national champions or big platforms that is from their own country competing against other platforms around the world. And that's not the case for every country. However, if you look in the picture below, you can see that there's already a couple countries that is in this process of diffusion. So a couple countries have enforced the law, namely EU, Germany, UK, Japan. And then there's a lot of countries that is in the drafting process, which is uh, the US, Korea, India, Brazil, Thailand, Turkey. These are all the countries that had a draft law. Um, and a lot of countries are doing reports or market studies. And one point of this picture is that to show that the phenomenon is relatively very quick. The Digital Market Act has only been enforced for about 1 year, starting from May 2023. So we always talk about how we need to see a successful policy will be diffused, but the DMA is not, it is to be seen if it's a successful policy or not, but already everyone is taking their initiative to copy that. So there's something that I want to highlight here in the diffusion process. Now, an overview of the rest of the article of the presentation will be that I'm interested in the diffusion trend and the customization of the EU Digital Market Act, especially in Asian and BRICS country. And then where I'm interested in is the pre-adoption process. So I want to understand what factors shapes regulatory developments, what affects draft laws, and then I want to understand the why and how. So the design, the framing, and process of the DMA that enables this wave of diffusion. And here I am making an argument about there's a convergence, but there's different types of convergence. There's different pathways to convergence. And then there's a lot of customization, which can be alarming, and it's a rush process. Maybe there's some abusive borrowing here. The second part of my presentation will be about how there's some implications, and maybe we can say it's unintended consequences. So the first one is the Digital Market Act, which is intended to regulate the whole tech sector, is uniting big tech around the world to push back against these legislative developments. But although the big tech is pushing back, there's still a lot of factors that would influence the outcome of such legislation. So, and I'm identifying a couple. So first is the customization. So it really depends on who are you regulating. If you regulate only the US platforms, then local tech companies might be happy and support that law. But if you're regulating local platforms, they might join the US platform in pushing back the law. And then another factor is probably the interaction between domestic and international law, in a sense that where does the voter come in? How does the politician uses international law, international models, or how national champion, which may likely have more connection to the state, thinks about these international models and how they use their domestic power to exercise the direction of the policy. And lastly, although a lot of this is domestic law, it can also have an international element to it. So that's why I mentioned in the third part, which is the role of international law and trade agreements. As we have seen in the literature that I mentioned, international models are very influential. They can nudge politicians or even voters to believe in a policy direction, even when it's not fit for their own country, or even if it's fit for their country. So this is the overview of the second part of my presentation. So the next part will be the details. So I will start off how I'm thinking about how to trace this regulatory diffusion. So first, I'm creating a typology of when policymaker thinks about competition law, they think of at least in 4 steps that I think. So the first step is ground into the traditional competition law ex post approach. This includes the most easiest is to create soft law, doing guidelines, doing market studies, or making public statement about the policy direction. So normally these soft law can be initiated by the agency itself. No need to go through any big process. And then a more harder process is to change the law. So making amendments here. And just to highlight, in digital platforms, we've talked about how we need to update market definition, establishing new conducts or evidentiary rules. So many countries have done this approach too. But then the main focus that I want to is interested in is the third and fourth step, where countries think that the traditional competition law is not enough, and they say they need to have a regulatory approach. We call this ex ante approach, and the ultimate. And I divide this into 2 steps. So the first one is a specific sector service. So some countries start with app stores law, for example, like Japan. But then the other countries like the EU just tackle a multi-service digital market act. And to collect information, I divided the information collection into 5 steps. So from announcement, expert report, draft legislation, public consultation, and enforcement. Um, so this is just a visualization of what's the EU DMA timeline, and I've just shown some pictures of the some reports or some important posts of each step. So you can see the first picture on the left side, the green box, is when the DMA was first announced, and it was accompanied by a report to the competition policy for the digital era. And then subsequently, throughout a 15-month legislative process, the EU produced three drafts, and there are many public consultations. And there's new research on analyzing these public consultations already. For example, this one is from Stanford Computational Antitrust, a very interesting project here at Stanford, where they kind of analyze, do people or do stakeholders understand the same meaning of each word? So do people understand the word gatekeeper? Does people understand market power? And this research shows that it's not that everyone is not on the same page when talking about digital antitrust. So that's very important. And then the last part is how the implications of the Digital Market Act. So now we're seeing a lot of enforcement from the DMA, but even before enforcement, the tech companies have also changed their business model. So these are all the information is out there for policymakers to think about this issue. And like many reports that has been issued by many government, one of the key reasons that this issue is so hard is because there's so much information out there, and the policymakers have to analyze and choose and select which one to come from. Now, so a very big trend that I want to describe that I think I see is that there is although everyone is converging, there are different ways of converging through types of countries. So I think, and it's interestingly divided by first, rich countries or well-resourced countries, I think has the resource to think hard and think clearly about this. So they're doing incremental development and kind of starting from the service specific regulation. So Japan and South Korea, I think, is falling into this area. UK is also doing a DMA style, but slightly different with more flexible guidelines. And Australia, also well-resourced, but far away from EU, is kind of taking it slow, but invest in understanding the digital market very good. So they had the Digital Platform Service Inquiry in 2020 to 2025. So that means they're investing 5 years of research to tackle these problems. Now, subsequently, it seems that Australia is also signaling that they are interested in an ex-ante approach. Now, surprisingly, the BRICS country, which is also a huge country, but not as well resourced, and their history of enforcing competition law might not be as long as other countries that we have talked about, they are taking a more leapfrogging approach, which is it seems that it's a rush process, and they wanted to do a DMA-like approach, a multi-sector regulation. There's fewer consultation. There's some countries have less transparency in the information we can access to understand the process. And a country that I want to just bring up real quick is South Africa, where they had like a soft law, like a market study, which is a binding market study, but they really rely on the DMA. So this is an indirect influence of DMA, which I think is very important. They refer to the DMA compliance as a commitment compliance to their law too. So this is very interesting innovation from these BRICS country. Now, the two other BRICS country, China and Russia, I think, has not done any ex-ante approach yet, but I think I have some justification for that. For me, if tackling big tech or addressing big tech concentration is the goal of the law, it seems that China and Russia, traditional law has, or using other means, have already successfully achieved this purpose. So right here I have China. China, we know that China has been very influential in actively using antitrust against their big tech, but also getting collaborations with big tech to comply with what they discussed. There was a big Chinese tech crackdown, although the word crackdown can be contested. Some people say it's a more collaborative process. And it lasts almost 1.5 year. And the Chinese the big tech market did suffer. They lost a lot of values, but then it seems there was a lot of working or directions from the government. And at some point during this whole process, there was some consideration of a guideline that is a super platform guideline, and people at the time also considered this like very similar to the EU. And then Russia, on the other hand, from previous research, we know that Russia is very active in their antitrust law too. In a sense that they use antitrust law for price control, but in the big tech context that we're interested in, they've been successfully finding these big techs too. For example, they find Apple $12 million, and this was at during the war in Ukraine. So people were criticizing this antitrust violation as giving more money, Apple giving money to the Russian state budget in the during a war crisis. And then if some people might be familiar with this news, but Google was just fined um, 20 decillion. So that's a lot of and that is more than the world total wealth. This is not directly a antitrust case, but it was a more content moderation case against YouTube and content moderation that was um, had to that the Russia court ordered to had to put it back up. But the amount of fine is absurd. But if you can find that much amount to some multinational big tech, it seems like your type of law is very effective. But even though very effective in this way, it does not mean that they can get that money. And even the Russia jurisdiction acknowledged that this fine is very symbolic. But that explains the BRICS approach here. So what I'm getting to is that despite all these developments, it seems that everyone is moving right here. And there's a lot of reasons for ex ante and against ex ante. The for ex ante is that they think that ex post is not enough, it's too low. And there's a need for fairness and contestability in digital market. A lot of countries also think their users, their small medium business in their country relies a lot on these big tech, so they need some rules to help them. But the reason against ex ante is also very strong. Usually the news that I read will say that X country is not Europe. We don't have the same history. We don't have the same approach to antitrust law. And this is true in a sense. But it's also true that EU has a lot of influence here. And then second, there's always a debate about an innovation and regulation trade-off. And another reason is the untested model. People who go a bit more further will say this is very political, populist, or even protectionist. Protectionist in a way means that because these laws kind of target US platforms, and in some countries, there's always a discussion about if regulation regulates US platform, it may give outweigh to other platforms. Sometimes it is the local champion, sometimes it's the big Chinese platform that is operating in that country. And lastly, and this is very important, is that some people will say that EU is a big country and they have a lot of enforcement muscle, but a country that has no or has less competition law enforcement experience and resource will not be able to do that. And that is a very important question that needs to be answered for any country that is deciding to develop these countries. However, I think because of the design and framing of the DMA, states are designing to do it anyway. So our audience here is probably very competition law educated, so I won't go through everything, but I divided DMA into three parts, which is the objectives. The second part is the framework, and the third part is the implementation rules and reports. So it's what comes after the first legislation draft. And just to highlight some factors, fairness and contestability is a very big concept. It's a neutral concept enough that people can find support in it. I think no one can deny that fairness is a good thing to have, or contestability is a good thing to have. So this broader policy objective kind of resonates with a lot of country. And EU is positioning itself as a leading regulator, so it's a value signaling here. And to be fair, when we hear the news about EU enforcement, we will always hear that EU has fined 1 billion, 20 billion. So I think the voters here are very used to, or the perception of EU is very clear that they have had very effective enforcement experience. And then another one is there is not quite a strong competing model here. So when UK is trying to do this a bit, and UK is saying that like, hey, our more flexible approach is better than the EU. But we don't know how the UK model is going to work yet. As contrast to EU, we're starting to see its result now. And I think there's a bias to change. So even the US approach, where they say traditional competition law works, there's some minor change that we need, but a regulation is not necessary. This doesn't go well with a bias to change or bias for change for policymakers around the world. Lastly, a detailed template with adaptable components, which I mean the gatekeeper destination. Countries can choose and pick and build the jigsaw, what platform they want to regulate, or even the obligation list. Even if they don't agree with, for example, self-preference, they can just take it out from their draft law. So this jigsaw, this Lego element, I think makes the DMA very flexible and very adaptable. I'm gonna skip these parts, but one thing that we see is some customization. So it's clear that a lot of countries want their gatekeepers threshold to be lower. And this is one part necessary because EU is thinking in like a regional market. But for other countries, which is less smaller than the EU market itself, if they want to capture the tech companies, then they have to scale down the threshold. But that complicates things, and there might be more platforms that enter into the definition, unlike the EU 6 platform or 7 platform, now including Booking.com. And I think this is a clear trend across the board. Right now, we don't see much about the obligation, but I think I've seen data somewhere that self-preferencing is a very popular, everyone is following or has a obligation of self-preferencing. Maybe other rules are less popular, but again, is a lot of people are following the EU way. I have about 5 minutes left. I will speed up a bit, but I'm happy to talk in parts more in the discussion where we are interested in. So one thing that is not is the fine. Fines are a major part of the DMA, and I think this is where they signal that they're serious on tech. I just got a comment from an international law professor talking about that maybe countries are thinking about these fines instead of digital service taxes, because digital tax are a very important development, but it has stagnated a bit. It has slowed down a bit. Discussion about digital tax has not been working well. So maybe people are thinking about using antitrust fines to supplement that. So that is an interesting point that I just recently got. So international law models plays a big role, and I think there's less activity here. But interestingly, UN Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, had a model law and did a lot of report on this, kind of suggesting to go to the EU way. On the other hand, OECD has been silent about this, but their activity is more of an inventory. So they are creating a system, or these country members are creating a system to collect information, and these are information out there for policymakers around the world to see and copy. And as we can see in the G7, it's the UK, it's the EU, UK, Japan is moving one way, US is moving another. So people can see the trend from these information. Um, there's interesting regional dynamics too. I'm saying this shortly because we don't see much now, but traditional competition law in the EU style or EU version has successfully diffused around the world because of FTAs, free trade agreements, where EU kind of required or wanted to have their trade partners to have some kind of competition law. And the easiest way is to just copy EU competition law to get that agreement. Now, we don't see that yet. We don't see anyone demanding to adopt Digital Market Act. But for me, my argument here is there's a lot of MOUs or agreements between agencies, and I think there's always a knowledge sharing clause in it. And I think that this is another channel of where knowledge about the DMA is diffusing. Um, and yeah. And lastly, I will talk about the political economy of it. So we know that tech companies are very powerful. They invest a lot of money in lobbying, or even invest money in talking to the people with the stakeholders. I'll just talk real quick about two jurisdictions. So the first one is South Korea, and the second one is India. So for South Korea, I am borrowing Sang Yun's language here from his recent article, which I highly recommend to everyone to understand about the Korean development. But Korean experience has been a roller coaster. Um, I say this in three phases, but the first phase is that the first the first data point that I found about Korea is in an OECD roundtable. So back in 2020 or 21, OECD created a best practice roundtable on ex ante competition rule. And Korean mentioned in that venue that they're interested in adopting ex ante regulation. So Korean was very early in the game. And then they had some drafts. But then um, uh, there was an election and it went through a self-regulation era. And then now the third page, they have a new draft, but it also faced backlash. And now they're going back to revise traditional competition law. But what I want to say with the whole process is that um, a lot of when we're discussing Korean's development, there's always an international element in here. So for the first one is when the first type of law, which is aiming at App Store, came out, the New York Times said that it was a test for Biden international tech policy. So it's interesting how in a country far away, they're thinking about their own law. It kind of brings in the bigger empires that we've talked about into the discussion of whether to talk or not. And we can see that, like in the most recent one, even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has asked for more transparency in passing the law, calls for transparency and dialogue. As we can see, there is a pushback from the Korean experience. And it's interestingly, just one point is that when the law, the prime minister or the president at the time is quite known for being a pro-business, self-regulated approach, but he has changed his tune towards big tech. After some crisis, he has called, if I remember correctly, called some big tech companies unethical and called for a more regulated approach. And in a way, maybe it was a response to the crisis, but also there has been report that it was a response to a incoming election where his opposition parties, voters are taxi drivers or service drivers, service worker who relies on these platforms. So in a way, there's a election story here. And then cut to India. India also has a draft now. They were very active in creating a task force and come up with reports. I am showing here that in the report, a 151-page report, they studied almost 8 jurisdictions and how each jurisdiction are approaching. So that's a huge project to be doing in like a 1 year, 1.5 year. And they created a bill within, I think, 2 years. Now, there's also an international element. The ABA, which is the American Bar Association, um, had jumped in and created a written statement or input for commenting on the Indian draft bill. So it's a very long document, and it's very interesting how a professional entity has engaged in other countries' process. But one thing that I wanted to highlight is India kind of suggests that, hey, America had a draft law that looks ex ante. That means that it's kind of American also accepts ex ante regulation. It's just maybe the politics. That's why the law didn't pass. ABA come in and had another interpretation. They said like, oh, the Congress has not accepted this, so it doesn't mean, or you shouldn't interpret it as that US has some kind of support for ex ante regulation, and this is very interesting. The US ex ante bill, and there was five of them. Each is a little bit different, but it received major media attention at that time. So it's un understandable that people would think that there are some support in the US. Um, and then the other parts of this thing is criticized the customization of the India view. And I think I have a lot of other examples, but normally every customization has been criticized that is not following the EU or is even worse than the EU. So that's very interesting. There's also a lot of tensions between local platform and international platform. So India has like a internet association head by Google has a share which is from Google or from the US big tech, but then local members starting to voice disagreement of its association position. So there's a tension between members too. And you can see that and India, and we have to say, give some hats off to India because India has shown us some stakeholder submissions. So we can see that it's very clear that big tech and local stakeholders are on the opposite side of the spectrum. One doesn't support the DMA-like law, and another supports it wholeheartedly. So I'm showing Amazon and the Indian Trader Association, and the other one is Google and the Hotel and Restaurant Association. And it's very clear. And India designs its submission process to say, do you agree or not agree with ex ante regulation? But now, interestingly, I thought that India law would pass its transparency, local actor supported, but now it seems there's a pushback, and competition law in India is on pause right now. Now, from this article that I read, it seems that there's some staff changing in the Ministry of Commerce, so that's why it's slowed down. But it is to be seen what India will take. And so I will conclude with this. It's unclear yet what the future is, but I think there's three things that we can do to better prepare the world for a competition regulation. So the first one is, instead of a wait and see approach, which I think is one of the main recommendations that I see, I kind of agree, but also disagree a bit because I think we need to do a wait and learn approach. So what I mean by wait and learn, I think we are just still debating at the very top of the discussion. Is innovation good or is regulation good? That's too high of level. We need to go more and discuss on the enforcement experience from the EU or even other countries that have started to adopt these kind of law. So the policymakers around the world have to go deeper into understanding the effect of the law. And then the second one is we need to talk about the appropriate customization. So now we only see customization about high fines and lower gatekeeper thresholds. But what about regulation or obligation lists? How should we what is the versions that we can pick and choose? In a way, I am in support of experimentalism, although fragmentation can also lead to harm. Companies may not like that, but there has been some support on experimentalism. And second is we not only the technical aspect, but we do need to understand the political aspect of each law too. And I call this the regulatory pendulum in full swing. So as we have known from the data that I've shown, some country it is just because there's an election coming on, so this draft law came out, or a president changed his stance on big tech. So if we really want to understand what's going on in each country, we need to understand the political aspect of it too. And then third, is that international cooperation and international agreement is very important. Um, I think that state capacity in enforcing this is very important. And not many countries can do alone. For example, if Thailand wants to do a DMA, maybe it needs to think in a regional level with ASEAN countries or even with other countries in the Asia region. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much.